Okay, can everyone see the screen? Quick break. Boleh siapa-siapa respon, boleh nampak screen saya, slide saya.
Nampak doktor, nampak.
Okay, alright. Okay, so hari ini basically kita akan cover topik roti lah. The first is quick bread, which is roti yang dibuat tanpa yeast. Dan lagi satu adalah roti yang menggunakan yeast lah. So, okay, quick bread ni basically kalau kita ikut definisi dia, roti yang dibuat dengan cara cepat dan dinaikkan guna evening agent yang selain yeast lah. In this case, selalunya kita guna baking soda. Okay, right. For quick bread, biasanya kita ada dua jenis dough, iaitu soft dough. Soft dough tu biasanya kita gunakan dalam biskut. Okay, kita akan roll out dan cut itu shapes yang kita nak, dan kita buat ni menggunakan biscuit mixing method. Apa itu biscuit mixing method, kita akan tengok dalam video sebentar lagi. Dan lagi satu jenis dough yang kita guna dalam quick bread ni ialah batter lah. Meaning kita guna satu adunan dough yang pekat dan tebal. Okay. Okay, untuk gluten, siapa start mute mic tu? Saya tekan dengar siapa mengunyah. Siapa yang turn on mic tu? Okay, off mic. Sekejap. Okay, alright. Okay, so gluten development dalam quick bread ni, apa yang kita harapkan dalam quick bread ni ialah only slight gluten development is desired in most quick bread, sebab kita tak mau gluten tu develop ni, sebab kalau terlampau banyak gluten dalam quick bread kita, dia kelebihan gluten kalau dia develop dia memang akan bentuk tekstur yang firm, tetapi kalau terlalu banyak sangat dia akan jadikan jumlah roti tu keras. So that's why kita tak mau gluten development tu terlampau banyak, so kita guna flour atau tepung yang kurang kuat sikit lah. Okay, selalunya pastry ataupun cake flour yang kita guna lah untuk kurangkan gluten development tu. Okay, so muffin, loaf bread and pancake batters selalunya kita mix as little as possible. Biscuit dough is often likely nil, enough to develop some flakiness but not enough to toughen the product. Okay, kita mixkan dan kita juga ada kneading, meaning kita ulikan tepung tu, tapi kita tak buat proses tu lama sangat sebab kita tak nak dia terlampau keras. Right. Leavening agent do not create the same effect as the of yeast does. Okay, sebab kita pakai quick bread, sebab kita pakai leavening agent yang chemical, so dia takkan develop tekstur yang macam yeast develop. Okay. Popovers are exception among quick breads because they require significant gluten development. Next. Okay. So lazimnya dalam quick bread ni ada dua method ya. First is the biscuit method. Okay. Yang ni tak apa, you boleh baca sendiri. Saya nak terus kepada link video ni. Sebab the video ni basically a much simpler explanation, but basically dia cover apa yang ada dalam text slide ni. Just kena stop sharing. Okay, this is the biscuit method.
Mixing method.
Volume keluar tak?
Keluar, Dokter.
Okay, alright. Okay, let's see the video explanation here.
Now, this method is certainly used for biscuits, but it's also used for maybe scones or different types of cookies. So the ingredients and ratios may change, but the mixing method is going to stay the same, which is what we're going to learn today. So it's important with the biscuit method that we start with cold ingredients. So specifically the fat that we're using, in today's case, we're using butter, and the liquid that we're using, that these ingredients are cold. What's going to be important in the biscuit method is we're going to try to cut the fat into the flour, maintain big pieces of fat. When the fat is cold, it's going to be very hard, and it's going to maintain those big pieces that we're cutting in. If the fat gets hot, we're going to melt that fat, and it's going to disperse too much through the dough, giving us a tougher product instead of a flaky biscuit or flaky cookie like we're trying to achieve with our biscuit method. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to sift our dry ingredients together. So I'm using a tammy sieve or a drum sieve today. You could use, there are specific flour sifters that you can use, but this works just fine as well. So I'm going to place my tammy sieve over top of my bowl. I'm going to put my scaled flour, sugar, and salt. And the first step of all of our mixing methods is going to be proper scale. So it's important to make sure that we're starting with properly scaled ingredients, that we have the right measure of each of the ingredients. So I'm just going to use a bowl scraper and push these dry ingredients through my tammy sieve. Sifting these ingredients is going to do two things for me. The first is it's going to make sure that I work out any lumps that were in any of my dry ingredients. And it's also going to help ensure that my ingredients are well mixed together. Okay, so I have all my dry ingredients mixed together. The next thing I need to do is I need to cut my fat into my flour. So for that, I'm going to use a pastry cutter. And what I'm going to do is I have my cold fat and I have it cut into small pieces. If you start with really big pieces of fat, we're going to have to work it quite a bit to get it down to the proper size that we're looking.
Perhatikan dia kata, kalau guna butter ke margarine, pastikan you potong atau kecilkan dia sebelum masukkan, campurkan. Kalau campak seketul, memang susah lah you nak kacau.
For. Whereas if we start with it already cut, it's a little bit less work for us in this step. I'm going to go ahead and get my fat. I'm going to use my pastry cutter. You see I kind of make a rocking motion with my pastry cutter
Hancurkan dulu
as I
butter.
rotate my bowl. Just work to incorporate that fat. Now, depending on what product it is we're making, there are some, for example, there are certain pie doughs that call for walnut-sized pieces of fat. So the pieces of fat would be, really, really big. And then, for a mealy pie dough, maybe, it might call for a cornmeal texture where we really break apart this fat. So depending on the recipe that we're using is going to be the size that we cut our fat down to. If I wanted bigger pieces, I would be cutting it less. If I wanted smaller pieces, I would be cutting it more. Kind of a common one that we see is it calls for pea-sized pieces of fat. So that's what I'll show you today in this. All right, so I think I have about my pea-sized pieces of fat. And then you see I have a couple pieces of fat that are just left on my knife. I'm just going to use my fingers, press those out, make sure I don't leave any. Okay. And you can see here I have my pea-sized pieces of fat that are just cut into my flour, and that's exactly what I want. All right, so the next step is going to be to mix in my liquid. So I don't use my hands for this step in mixing, just because I have body heat, and I don't want to heat up that fat and melt that fat into the flour. So I'm going to, again, use my bowl scraper to incorporate this liquid. So I'm going to go ahead and add my liquid.
Tambah cair, susu ke air.
I'm just going to use my bowl scraper until all of my liquid is incorporated into my dry. It's important that I don't overmix. Overmixing is going to develop the gluten and could make tough biscuits.
So dia kata, jangan overmix. Elakkan gluten formation yang banyak.
All right. So I have my my base together in kind of this shaggy dough. My next step is going to be to knead my dough. So I'm going to put a little bit of flour down on my board. Make sure I get all of this dough out of my bowl. Use this bowl scraper. Scrape out my bowl. A little bit of flour on my hands, and I'm just going to work to collect this dough into a ball. So now I have a nice dough ball that's starting to form together. And I'm going to knead this about 20 turns. So I'm going to press it out and kind of fold it over. Press it out and fold it over. Give it a rotation. Now the way I knead this dough is going to help me have a nice dough ball that's going to form together, but I don't want to over knead it. So I said about 20 turns, which is what this biscuit recipe calls for. Too few kneads, it may not hold together. Too much, it's going to overdevelop that gluten, and I'm going to have tough biscuits. All right, so that was about 20 kneads, and you can see I have this nice dough ball now. So at this point, I would go ahead and let my dough relax. So I've developed a little bit of gluten by mixing and kneading. So I would let this dough ball sit, let that gluten relax, before I would roll it out and cut it into the proper size.
Okay, so dia kata sebelum dia nak spread the dough tu, penyetkan dia dan print out ataupun apa, cut out the piece yang dia nak dalam bentuk biskut. Pastikan dia, you rehatkan dulu dough tu ya. Walaupun you tak guna yeast, you tetap kena rehatkan dough.
For whatever application I'm using this method for.
Ini reviewnya.
So let's review. When using our biscuit method, we're going to begin by sifting together our properly scaled dry.
Start dengan sift dry ingredients. Use cold fat this week. Paling penting, jangan overmix or over knead your dough.
Next, remember with the biscuit method, it's important to use cold ingredients to ensure that our fat is properly dispersed throughout our dough. Finally, don't overmix or over-knead your dough. We want to make sure that we have a tender product in the end and not overdevelop the gluten, which will give us a tough product.
Okay, so that's the first method, which is the biscuit method. So far, any questions?
Okay, Doktor.
Ada apa-apa yang Yang nak tanya?
Ada.
You're right. Proceed to the next method, which is the muffin method. Okay.
In this video,
The second method in quick bread is the muffin method. Yeah. See the second video.
we're going to learn about the muffin mixing method. So for any baking method, we're going to start with properly scaled ingredients, which I have scaled out by weight here. So to begin our muffin method, we need to start by sifting our dry ingredients together. So I'm going to use a tammy sieve or a drum sieve for this. Just place this right over top of my bowl. So I'm going to add from this muffin ratio I'm using, we're going to use flour, sugar, baking powder, and salt. Then I'm going to use my bowl scraper and just press the dry ingredients through my sieve. All right, so I have my dry ingredients sifted together. I'm going to just set this aside. And our next step is going to be to combine all of our liquid ingredients. So that's going to include, for this ratio, our milk, our eggs, and our oil. For this ratio, we're using oil. If I was using butter, I would melt the butter, and I would include that in my liquid ratio as well. And lastly, I'll include my vanilla extract. All right. Now I want to use a whisk and just combine all of my liquid ingredients.
So first step, kita kacau liquid ingredients dulu ya. Kita terus
It's important that we have the liquid ingredients well combined, because in our next step, when we add our liquid to our dry ingredients, we're going to try to mix as little as possible. So if I didn't have my egg well separated into my liquid ingredients, I would have to overmix when I added the liquid to the flour, which would give our muffins a tough consistency. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my liquid ingredients and pour them into my dry. Scrape out my bowl, make sure I have accurate ratio. And I'm just going to mix together my liquid and dry ingredients until all of my flour, all of my dry base is moistened. You're going to see that this is going to be a little bit lumpy, and that's okay. It's better to have this be a little bit lumpy than to overmix it and end up with tough muffins. You can see I'm scraping around the sides of my bowl, making sure I get the bottom so that there's no areas that aren't mixed. All right, so I'm going to go one more motion here. All right, so this is where I'm going to stop mixing at this point. You can see that all of our liquid and dry ingredients have combined together and are well moistened, but there are still some lumps remaining, and that's okay. It's better to have this be a little bit lumpy than to overmix it and end with tough muffins. This is also the point where if I was going to add maybe some fruit or chocolate pieces, whatever it may be, that I would go ahead and add that and mix that in as well. All right, so let's review our muffin mixing method. First, we're going to start by sifting together all of our dry ingredients. We're then going to combine all of our liquid ingredients, including the fat and eggs that we're
Save tepung atau dry ingredients dulu. Kemudian bowl yang asing kita akan kacau segala wet ingredients.
using, and then mix those wet and dry ingredients together. Finally, be careful not to overmix your muffins.
Dan dalam case tadi dia
Because in our next step, when we add our liquid to our dry ingredients, we're going to try to mix
prinsip dia ialah add liquid into the dry, not dry into the wet. Sebab kalau kita masuk dry yang wet, lagi senang dia nak kedel dan you kena pukul lagi lama. So kalau you add wet ke dalam dry ingredients, insyaAllah you punya kerja untuk mix the batter tu akan lagi mudah. Okay. Alright, for the muffin method ni, it's going to be applied apabila you buat resepi banana nut muffin ya. So you akan tengok dalam video esok. Okay.
All right.
And
So
lazimnya topping di tak kisahlah banana ke nut ataupun apa-apa buah akan ditambah lepas batter ni apabila stage ni misalnya. Apabila kita add wet ingredients to dry ingredients. And banana yang kita, ataupun apa fruit biasanya kita mash dia akan jadi wet, so that's why kita masukkan terus dan kacau je lah. Dry ingredients kita, kalau kita ada kacang ke resin kita akan masukkan. Okay, that's muffin method. So inilah summary step dia. Kita combine as if dry ingredients, combine liquid ingredient dulu and add the liquid into dry and then kacau. Apabila dah sepati baru kita masukkan dalam apa pacuan muffin dan masukkan oven. Okay, so that is muffin method secara ringkas. So far ada any question before kita proceed ke yeast products pula? For quick bread ni, for any of the muffin method ataupun biscuit method?
Doktor,
Ya.
macam mana nak tahu kalau kita overmix batter tu?
Sebenarnya kalau overmix tu, kalau kita makin lama makin kacau, makin you rasa makin pekat, makin likat. Sebab gluten bila dia develop, dia akan develop test dia dan dia akan mengeras. Okay. Kalau kacau-kacau, kalau dia yang paling penting bila kacau tu jangan pastikan ada small sections of flour yang kalau penuhi kriteria tu you tak perlu kacau lama, tapi elakkan daripada kacau terlalu lama sebab kalau makin lama you makin kacau dia akan makin pekat dan makin you kena guna force energy yang terlalu banyak. Okay, kalau so just make sure you kacau at least semua tak ada sakit baki tepung ataupun apa-apa yang kedel tu. Itu dah memadai, okay? You tak perlu kacau lama-lama. Sebab kalau you kacau lagi lama, dia akan digeras, okay? Okay tak? Siapa yang tanya tadi?
Saya, Doktor.
Okay, Dura. Prinsip dia, bila nak tahu dia over ni or over mix tu, makin kita ulikan, you akan rasa makin lama makin keras dan makin lama you perlu more effort untuk tu. So itu petandanya you perlu stop dah untuk uli tu. Okay? Boleh Dura?
Boleh, Doktor. Thank you, Doktor.
Okay, alright. Any other inquiries? Any other inquiries, pertanyaan sebelum kita proceed pada yeast pula? ada. Okay, kita proceed to the next. Alright, kita proceed pada yeast product pula. Ingat ya, quick bread kita tak pakai yeast, kita just guna a chemical based leavening agent. Yeast product. Share screen. Alright. So basically yeast product ni secara by obvious definition ialah dough di mana kita letak yeast di dalamnya lah, dan kita guna yeast tu untuk do the fermentation process apabila dia menguraikan gula dan menghasilkan carbon dioksida, which in turn expand the dough yang kita hasilkan tu. There are generally two types of dough in yeast products. One is the lean dough. Lean dough ni is low in fat and sugar, while the rich dough dia generally ada lebih banyak proportion of fat, sugar, and tambah juga sometimes dengan eggs. Okay. Ada various type of of mixing method dalam yeast ni. Okay. First one is the roll-in dough products. Roll-in or laminated dough ni is fat is incorporated to the dough in many layers by the means of rolling and folding procedures. Okay. The alternative of layer fat and dough gives the baked product flaky texture, and non-sweet roll dough such non-sweet roll in dough, contohnya croissant. Sweet roll in dough, belum masukkan gula. Danish pastries. Okay. When you do the mixing method, it has three main purposes. One is to combine ingredients to form a uniform smooth dough. Distribute the yeast evenly throughout the dough so that dia kembang dengan atau memproduce fermentation tu dengan sekata. Kita tak mau yeast to stay in just one area of the dough, so you will have an imbalanced bread nanti, and to develop a desirable amount of gluten. So these are the three purposes. Okay. Alright. Generally dalam mixing method dalam yeast product ni dia ada tiga, tetapi saya nak fokus pada dua ni saja, which the straight dough method and the sponge method. Okay. Jom kita buka link video ya. Siap. Ini sekali iklan pula keluar. Come on, skip. Okay. Okay, this is the straight dough method, yeah?
In this video, we're going to learn the straight dough mixing method. The straight dough method is used for making yeast doughs. And it's the most simple of the yeast dough mixing methods. So what we're going to do is I've started by blooming my yeast in my water. My water was about 100 degrees. We want that water to be between 90 and 100 degrees to bloom our yeast. My yeast has bloomed, and I can see the little kind of clouds forming in the water, the little plop of the bubbles. So at this point, I'm going to take my flour and I'm going to put it directly on top of my water and yeast. And then finally, I'm going to take my salt and put it right on top of my flour. I want to make sure I use the correct attachment. I'm going to use the dough hook. We're going to use this attachment when we're trying to develop gluten. So when we're making things like pasta doughs and yeast doughs, we're going to use our dough hook. So I'm going to go ahead and get my mixer set up here. So I'm going to mix at two different speeds. I'm going to mix at my first speed until I have my dough ball formed. Then I'm going to crank up the intensity of the mixing a little bit and mix until the gluten is fully formed. You're going to want to consult the formula that you're following for proper mixing times for your particular formula. So we'll start on our first speed, nice and low, till we have that dough ball formed.
Start dengan slower speed dulu. Tengok. Dalam contoh tadi dia pakai wet yeast. Tapi kalau kita guna dry yeast pun sama je step dia. Campur semua sekali.
So this formula is going to mix for about 4 minutes at the first speed before we go up to our second mixing speed. So once we're there, we'll check back in with you. All right, so it's been about 4 minutes. We've completed our first mixing. You can see that dough ball is nice and together. So the next step in our straight dough method is we're going to mix at our second speed. So the amount of time is going to depend on the formula that you're using for the amount of time it's going to take to develop that gluten. Instead of just the very slow initial mix, we would do it on about a medium speed to help with that gluten. So for this formula, we would go ahead and mix on our second speed for about 10 to 12 minutes and allow that gluten to develop. And you can see that was the speed I would be using. You can see how much faster that was than our first. So let's review. When using active dry or fresh yeast, you'll start by blooming the yeast in the water. If you're using instant yeast, you can mix the yeast right in with the
Dia kata kalau guna instant yeast, campur je terus dengan tepung.
flour and skip that step of blooming the yeast. Next, make sure that your water is between 90 and 100 degrees to ensure that the yeast activates properly. Lastly, make sure you're using the correct attachment with your mixer. When we're making yeast doughs and
Disclaimer tadi, ni dalam Fahrenheit ya. 90 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Kita nak elak terlalu panas sangat sebab kalau terlalu panas, yeast you akan mati.
your mixer. When we're making yeast doughs and trying to develop gluten, we're going to want to use a dough hook.
Okay. Dia akan mix dough tu sampai dia dia betul-betul mix. Dan nak tahu apabila bila dough tu betul-betul mix, bila dikacau-kacau nanti, dia akan satu form a very nice round shape dan round shape tu tak akan melekat langsung dalam bowl tu. So that is the indicator you punya dough tu dah well mixed and you boleh angkat dough you untuk direhatkan for the required amount of time so that the yeast expands the dough, and after that you uli kari kedua, uli make the bread into shape or the desired shape and then masukkan ke dalam oven. Okay, alright, so that is a straight dough method. So method ni you akan tengok dan apply apabila you buat red bean muffin nanti ya. Okay. Yeah, so that is a straight dough method. The second method is the sponge dough method. Okay, let's go to the next video. kan sponge dough yang kita buat pada awal step tu dimasukkan dalam the new batter yang dia buat ni, kemudian dia mixkan. Ni jadi seperti dia masukkan butter. Berbeza dengan straight dough method, kita masukkan semua ingredient sekaligus, tapi sponge method perhatikan you kena buat first set of dough, sponge dough tu sama, dan kemudian you buat second dough, adunkan sekali dengan sponge dough tu, and kemudian you masukkan butter. Mixing or kneading. Dan dia bentuk bulat. Sama juga straight dough, you kena restkan dulu sebelum you nak proceed to the next step of second round kneading, or you want to shape the bread into specific shape before you put into the oven. Nama dia proses. Dalam kes ni dia nak buat loaf. So, inilah hasilnya. Dia keluar. Okay. Apabila you koyakkan ni, dia akan ada apa? Soft elastic texture ke dalamnya. Sponge dough ni. Soft, tapi dia akan kembali kepada shape dia, apa boleh kan? And that's done. Okay, so that is the example of how sponge dough method is being done. Secara ringkasnya, sponge ni you kena buat sponge dough first before you mix it with the normal dough yang you tengok the straight dough tu, and last kali baru you masuk butter. Once those 2-3 things has been made, sama juga yang straight dough, you need to rest the dough, let the yeast do the fermentation and kembangkan volume, and after that baru you boleh shape your bread into desired taste and masukkan dalam oven. Okay, so that is sponge dough method. Alright, ada sikit lagi, one more video. Kelas banyak video. So, right, the final part is the steps in yeast dough production. Okay, regardless whether you use straight dough or sponge dough or any other known method. Production involves these 12 steps, which is first, mestilah you scale the ingredients, timbang sukat. Kedua, mix. Third, bulk fermentation. Fourth, folding or punching. Fifth, scaling. Sixth, rounding. 7, benching. 8, makeup and planning. 9, proofing. 10, baking. 11, cooling. And number 12, storing. You boleh baca ini semua nanti dalam slide ni. But for this class, tengok video je lah. Penerangan dan demonstrasi proses yang dilalui. Alright, the 12 steps in yeast dough.
Today I'm going to demonstrate the 12 steps to yeast dough production. The first step is to scale out your ingredients. So you weigh everything out so it's accurate.
Ini penting ya kelas sebab 12 dough ni adalah prinsip in yeast baking product. Tak kisahlah you pakai apa sekali method, whether it's sponge ataupun straight method ataupun apa-apa saja method, you kena lalui 12 basic steps ni, okay?
Then we're going to take our warm, slightly warm water and our active dry yeast in this case, and we're going to put it in the water. And you want to let your yeast sit in the warm water for 2-3 minutes just to kind of dissolve a little bit. It won't completely dissolve, it'll get a little lumpy, but just so that it will soften. While you're doing that, we're going to put it on the mixer. Make sure your mixing bowl is completely on your mixer. And then we're going to use the dough hook attachment. And this will replicate kneading the dough. So once you've given your yeast a little bit of time to absorb some water, you're going to take your flour. And this is 22 ounces of bread flour. We're going to use almost all of it. We'll leave a little bit out. This is the straight dough mixing method.
Straight dough tadi.
So the second step
demonstrate.
is mixing it. So we'll leave
Kalau you guna dry yeast, you boleh masukkan saja terus.
a little bit on the side just in case we don't need it all. And then you add your salt. You always want to put your flour in before you add your salt because salt is very important in yeast dough production. It controls the growth of the yeast and gives it flavor. It helps develop gluten. But if the yeast comes in direct contact with the salt, it will kill the yeast. So turn it on low.
Mixing.
Once it starts to come together, turn it up a little bit. And you can see most of the flour has been picked up. At this point, I'm going to scrape down the bowl. And feel it. Maybe add just a tiny bit more flour. And not all of it. And then turn it back on low. Of course, when you add flour, don't add it on high. Once all the flour has been picked up, we can turn it up a little bit. And now we're going to start kneading the dough. We want to knead our dough until it's nice and smooth and elastic. At this point, you could let the dough rest for 5 minutes and let all the gluten absorb water, and then come back and just finish it in a minute or two. Or you can continue on to knead it from start to finish. That time where we let the gluten absorb the water shortens the kneading time, and especially if you're kneading by hand, that is a good thing because it takes a lot of energy to knead by hand. So you can see how the dough is looking different than it was, but it's still a little lumpy, it's still a little broken up, so it has to go a little bit further. I'm thinking it needs a little bit more flour.
Skip.
Our
Okay, lepas inilah
dough
rupa
hook up.
doughnya apabila dia dah well mix, dia tak akan melekat. Tapi dia akan terkumpul in one almost round shape. So dia akan proceed pada
And if you look at the dough
fermentation,
itself,
kan,
you can see it's smooth and elastic, has a good stretch to it. One way you can test to see if it's kneaded enough is you take a little piece off and then roll it in your hands. And if it gets smoother and stretchier, then it needs more kneading. And if it starts to kind of fall apart like this is, then it's done. So from here, I'm going to put a little tiny bit of oil in the bowl, and then I'm going to cover it, wrap a little bit of oil on top of the dough, and then I'm going to cover it with a towel. And now it's time for it to do the bulk fermentation. Bulk fermentation is where it doubles in size. This is the period of time where you develop most of the flavor for the bread. So very important. The longer your bulk fermentation, the better your bread will taste. So we'll be back in a couple hours. Our dough has had time to rest and bulk ferment. It is now ready to move on to our folding or punching stage. And this is where once it's double inside, you press the air out.
Kita uli itu.
From here, the next step is to scale out portions. And this particular recipe makes approximately 12 French rolls. So what I do is I divide it, create a log, divide the log in two, and then into 4 pieces. And then each piece I divide into 3. While you're working on the dough, you want to try to keep it covered. And you want to start with the ones that you did first. Gluten needs to relax, or it will stretch and just kind of spring back to the shape that it was to start with. So what I want to show you now is how to round. And the way we round is by pressing the dough against the table and then pulling it back to create a seam on the bottom. So again, you take your dough, cupping your hand, using your fingers to tuck the dough under and creating that seam.
Teknik ni you akan guna apabila you buat soft roll nanti. Soft roll red bean bun.
Push and then pull back, tucking with your fingers. Once you start to get used to doing this, you start to do it with 2 hands. And the idea is you're creating surface tension so you get a nice smooth roll. So I'm not rolling like that. I'm actually pressing the dough and stretching it. At this point, you need to let the dough rest again for 15 to 20 minutes. This is called benching. And since we're not actually making any other shape besides nice round rolls, what I'm going to do instead is take them and place them directly onto my pan.
Tahap panning, ini kita taruh dalam pan sebelum kita nak masuk dalam oven.
Space them evenly. Again, we cover them to keep them from drying out and forming an elephant skin.
Okay. Cover untuk elakkan dry. So, di kata lain, kain yang you tengok dia tutup untuk tutup dough ni ialah kain yang basah ya, bukan kain yang kering sebab kita nak maintain moisture dalam dough tu. Okay.
And from here, we're going to double in size again during our proofing stage. If these were a richer dough, you wouldn't want to, at this point, if you proof them till they're double, they would collapse in the oven. But this is a real lean dough. You saw we had no fat in it at all. So we're going to let them double in size. Again, it should take about an hour and a half, 2 hours. Our rolls have had a chance to double in size. When you press on them, they don't spring back. What you want to do is take a sharp knife and just score the tops gently. It gives a place for the seam to escape. And then I have an oven, 450 degrees for a lean dough with a pan of a little bit of water in the bottom. So I open up the oven and I put the rolls in. And then I take water and I create some steam and I close the door. This will give your rolls a golden color and help create a crusty French bread.
Another technique untuk bagi golden color is you tapuk egg wash dekat atas bukan roti, okay? Misalnya you nak buat soft roll, French loaf ke apa-apa, sapu egg wash and then masuk dalam oven.
Without the steam, they just don't get as much color and they don't get as crusty. The rolls have been in the oven about 20 minutes. They should be done. Let's see. Nice and golden colored. You pick one up and thump the bottom and it should sound hollow. And they're ready. The next step to yeast dough production is you want to let them cool, move them onto a rack so there's air circulating. If you leave them on the pan, moisture can build up and then go soggy. So you want to move them to a rack and let them cool off.
Kalau nak cool off, jangan biar dalam pan, kita pindahkan pada rack. Kalau kita biarkan dalam pan ni, dia akan form moisture kat bawah dan you punya ban jadi soggy, dia kata.
And once they're completely cool, you can wrap them up to store them or, of course, serve fresh.
Right. So that is the 12 steps to yeast dough production. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Okay lah untuk hari ni. Alright. So that is the principle behind yeast product. Yeah. Alright. Ada apa-apa pertanyaan tak tentang ni? Tentang penghasilan roti daripada yeast for yeast products?
Doktor,
Okay.
nak tanya,
Boleh.
selalunya roti tak kembang sebab faktor apa?
Kalau tak kembang, biasanya teknik masa you uli tu, faktor utama dia ialah yeast lah. Mungkin yeast you mati pada peringkat yang terlalu awal. Okay. Kalau you guna wet yeast biasanya and you masukkan air, kalau you gunakan air yang panas, biasanya dia akan bunuh yeast tu lah. But the major factor kalau roti tu tak kembang, sama ada yeast you mati cepat sangat disebabkan faktor haba ataupun taburan yeast you tak sekata. Okay. Dapat tak tadi? Siapa yang tanya tadi?
Doktor.
Right. So in yeast production tu kita kena make sure temperature tu tak terlalu panas lah, sebab yeast tu benda yang hidup. Kalau tinggi sangat yeast tu akan mati and you don't have anything to naikkan you punya roti tu. Okay. Any other ni queries? Lain-lain pertanyaan? So, bersama saya ke? Semua dah kenyang makan roti dah. Ni okey, alright. Penting untuk tahu apabila masuk test dan exam, dan juga prinsip ni penting untuk tahu apabila you nak buat you punya quick bread dan juga roti nanti ya. Okey. Alright. Sebelum tu saya kena few housekeeping announcement ya. Saya kena buka e-learn. Okay, for this week's lab, saya alhamdulillah dah berjaya upload resipi dan juga video demonstration. So, you all akan tengok each video demonstration ni dan buat you punya lab report dan hantar based on this link below. Okay. Cuma saya nak disclaimer kat sini. French bread, saya dan Cik Nick tak guna dedicated dough yang lean dough untuk demonstrate French bread. Apa yang kita orang buat ialah kita buat dough berdasarkan soft red bean bun punya dough, which is rich dough. Kita bahagi dua. The first part kita proceed dengan isi dengan red bean punya inti filling kat dalam, and then the second part of the dough tu kita uli dan shapekan ikut French bread. Okay. So just note that French bread ni kita pakai dough yang sama untuk soft roll lah. Penamat nut muffin biasalah kita it's a separate recipe and kita guna baking powder saja. Alright. Okay. And another disclaimer, untuk soft roll red bean bun ni ada berlaku sedikit kesilapan teknikal masa rakaman. Sepatutnya sebelum masuk dalam oven, saya dan lab staff dah pun letak egg wash atas bun tu sebelum masukkan dalam oven, tetapi that part somehow tak menjadi. So dalam video tu you akan tengok lepas kita shape, and then dia akan terus jump kepada end product. Tapi just untuk bagi tahu kat you, siap-siap. Sebelum masuk ke dalam oven, memang perlu you letak egg wash atas red bun tu. Boleh faham ya guys? Boleh faham tak?
Faham, Doktor.
Okay, alright. And sekejap saja. Okay, Assalamualaikum dan selamat pagi semua. Alright, okay. Untuk nampak video ni, tengok saya dah put disclaimer dah kat sini. For putting buns inside oven, make sure to put out of bun using egg wash. This will contribute to the golden brown color on top. Okay. Alright. See the video, do the report based on the video and submit to this link ya semula. For last week, link dia di sini. Ada yang tanya saya apa nak submit ni link pada mana? Last week's lab report ialah through this link here for week 9. Ada tak yang hantar? Orang pun tak hantar lagi. You still have 5 days to submit ya sebelum ni due date. And apabila submit ni, seorang tak perlu dua-dua orang dalam satu team tu submit. Just make sure you communicate with your team member. Okay, siapa A nak submit atau B submit. Kalau A setuju untuk submit, B tak perlu submit. Okay? Okay, faham tak? Collab? Apa tanya? Boleh buat dalam table ke? Boleh buat in table, tetapi pastikan you label lah which step is number 1, 2, 3, 4. You nak buat dalam table, you nak buat dalam chart, or you nak buat dalam paragraph pun boleh. Just make sure you buat it in chronological order. Boleh tak Fazlin? Okay ke? Okay, alright. Okay. So ni untuk last week punya ni. So for this week's labs, this week's lab session sama juga masuk pada link ni. Bila dah ready, click the submission button. Deadline will be next 12 hari, which will be 12 hari bulan 6 sebelum pukul 12.30 malam. Okay? Alright. So ni untuk lab session and reminder untuk apa? Your lab submission for last week and juga the upcoming week. Okay? Alright. My final announcement. Final announcement of the day would be about the lesson plan. Yeah. Okay, we are now at week 10. Kita dah cover quick bread dan yeast product. Next week, kita cover the final theory topic, which is spice and pastries. Saya baru saja dapat hubung kontak di industri. So, kita akan buat industrial talk untuk subjek ni pada 21 hari bulan 6, which is about week 13 kalau tak silap saya. Okay. So your industrial talk will be on the ialah pegawai penyediaan give a talk on and bagi gambaran kepada you how is the scenario of food preparation in the hospital setting. Okay. So take note ya, you punya industrial talk will be on the 21st of June pada waktu kelas teori you antara pukul 8 hingga pukul 10. Okay. Which means test tu kita akan awalkan kepada minggu 12 ni, pada 14 hari bulan. It will cover all the topics yang saya mengajar ni. Okay, okay tak semua kelas? And test tu kita akan buat pada waktu kelas juga, antara pukul 8 hingga pukul 10. Tapi test tu bukannya 2 jam, hanya 1 jam saja. Clear tak semua? Apa tanya dah? Sebelum tu, okay. Sebelum tu siapa tanya? Lab report tu hantar dalam PDF atau Word? Hantar dalam Word version ya, Fatihah. Okay. All your reports hantar dalam bentuk words. Okay. Alright. So maksudnya itu saja ya. So quick reminder, test you kita akan buat akan ada set password dan access macam mana. Okay. And minggu ke-13 insyaAllah kita akan hospital Kuala Terengganu untuk give a talk and give you an exposure on how food preparation is done in the hospital setting. Alright. Okay. Sebelum kita wrap up the class, ada apa-apa lagi pertanyaan ataupun concerns to be addressed? Any last words? Siapa-siapa? You still with me? Semua senyap dah ni? Okay. Okay, kalau tak ada apa-apa, kita jumpa next week's class. So by default, kalau saya tak cakap apa-apa, kita akan buat kelas ni online juga ya. Unless kalau few days saya announce saya ada hal lain, ada meeting ke, ada emergency family, saya akan announce, saya akan buat record video. Tapi kalau saya tak cakap apa-apa, means kita akan buat online class ya. Alright. And for those yang ada masalah lain, keluar masuk, tak apa, saya dah record kelas ni. Apabila dah ready, saya akan upload through YouTube channel saya dan share link dalam group dan juga dalam e-learn. Okay. So don't worry siapa yang kurang bernasib baik keluar masuk, lekat-lekat. Recording akan siap by tengah hari nanti. Okay. Alright, kalau tak ada apa-apa, for Muslim, we end the attendance yang bestnya melalui Webex ni, dia akan rekod siapa yang attend the talk. So through Webex tak perlu isi attendance, okay? Alright. Okay. Alright. Ni kelebihan ni lah. Sebab kalau Google dia tak ada feature tu, so kena ambil attendance by manual. But Webex dia akan keep macam special log siapa yang datang kelas, siapa yang tak ada dalam kelas. Okay. Walaupun you keluar masuk, sekalipun you punya nama tetap akan ada. Siapa yang tak hadir tu, pandailah terasa ataupun menjawab. Okay. Right. Okay, kalau tak ada apa-apa, we end our class today with Tasku Kibarah yang surah Tuwal As. Bismillah.
Terima kasih, Doktor.
Okay, thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Remember to follow tomorrow's lesson, yeah, yang video demonstration tu, and prepare the report for the deadline.
Baik, Doktor. Terima kasih.
Okay, right. We'll see each other insyaAllah next week. Thanks. Take care, everyone.
Terima kasih, Doktor. Take care, Doktor.
Right.
Thank you, Doktor.
Okay.
Terima kasih doktor.
Thank you, Doktor.